As many of you know, I'm a fan of Souls-like games. I'm bad at them, but I enjoy them, and many Souls-likes I actually end up beating eventually just through sheer stubbornness. So today we're going to look at a game I couldn't quite get good enough to finish off, and that is There Is No Light. Though the reason behind that is a mix of pros and cons for this title that may entice some, but dissuade others. Needless to say, despite being sold as a 2D Souls-like, it does break several of the rules and design philosophies that have made the genre what it is, though as you know, I don't cover games like this unless I think they have at least some promise. That said, first off, if you played the demo for There Is No Light, the gameplay is the same, but your loadout will definitely feel different, since you won't have access to many of the weapons you tried until later. So don't go into this expecting many of those areas to feel the same, since you will be stuck with just the starter sword for an extended period of time, only unlocking the other weapons and their abilities after completing a good portion of the game. Now, this does bring into the spotlight the mechanics of the game, and as far as the actual combat goes, it feels much the same as other Souls-likes, with dodges, attacks, counters, etc. Although, for much of the game, you will need to understand the red attack versus yellow attack system, which is one that basically tells you whether an enemy's attack can be interrupted or not. And needless to say, this is one of the tools that normally would be fine, but in There Is No Light, it often reads as artificial difficulty, since beyond the early stages, you'll find most attacks, even by trash enemies, are just yellow, straight out. So you'll just be dodging most of the time regardless of how many enemies it throws on screen. This artificial difficulty is likely amplified by how the game handles its enemy distribution and placement, which, while you're traveling through an area, the distribution is just fine, but as you reach certain points along a zone, you'll find what are essentially challenge zones, where you will be attacked by wave after wave of enemies that you need to beat in progress. The first few of these feel okay, but you'll notice a trend fairly quickly that these zones like taking somewhat cheap shots, such as frequently placing artillery enemies you cannot kill off screen. At least you can't kill them until you've finished the area. And in one case, it even endlessly spawned a healing enemy on me regardless of how many times I killed it. I'm not sure if that was a bug or not, but I'm hoping it was. It just made it frustrating to kill the final wave especially. That said, this becomes commonplace. It's not that the enemies individually or even in small packs are especially dangerous. It's just instead of the enemies being challenging in and of themselves, it decides to take the more hectic route to battle and solve any problems with just more bodies and missiles, and more to dodge in general, which means you're either going to take stupid damage to speed it up, or spend a massive portion of your combat just dodging the garbage since they are very rarely synced up in their attack patterns, which greatly slows down the feel of an otherwise action-styled game that could be very quick feeling. This, combined with the fact that whether you can dodge off the edge of the platform is, well, inconsistent at best, means you'll sometimes be testing that aspect either intentionally or unintentionally in many of these fights, as well as the boss fights themselves. And while this dodge mechanic is integral to level navigation, with the game having its fair share of platforming puzzles of various types that are quite enjoyable, it feels somewhat haphazard in its application. Now, since we mentioned bosses, those are, well, hit or miss again. They range from pushovers to enjoyable bouts where it felt appropriately challenging, though they also can go all the way to annoying twitchy dodge fests and overly long Zerg modes with hard limits on how often you can hit the actual boss itself. So you may have fun against a few bosses, but you can expect at least a handful of them to be kind of irritating on at least one level or another. Though if you like a challenge that keeps it mixed up, it will be good for you since the bosses are at least quite varied in flavor in a good way. Now, you may be saying I'm being a bit harsh on the game at this point and that I should just get good or put it on easy mode. And on some levels you might be right, though I often felt like what was getting to me was more how the gameplay is disjointed from the game design, not necessarily the difficulty of the individual parts. Since it's actually a dodge and evade heavy game, which would be fine if it was consistently designed for that, but it comes with combat that feels like it should be in a much faster combat style, basically due to how its abilities in combat and healing effects work. It's basically like if you took Devil May Cry and tried to smash it into the original Dark Souls, just in 2 dimensions instead. And this is weirdly mirrored by how it handles the difficulty settings, since when I played through, the only differences between easy mode and normal mode were that you got one free healing bauble, and it didn't have your alignment penalized by opening checkpoint gates or these little lockboxes that give you extra healing. It says it reduces the number of enemies as well, but having gone through a few areas on both difficulties, there was no difference in that aspect from what I could tell, at least not where it mattered, nor any difference in the outgoing or incoming damage. But maybe I was just expecting it to be more noticeable than it was, and I just overlooked some small differences. And all this is stacked on a much more static character development. Yes, you can spend your experience from killing enemies on improving your attacks and combos, but beyond that, you're not going to feel much in the way of changes to your character. If a boss can 3-shot you, they will be able to 3-shot you no matter how much you grind through other areas. Though keep in mind, grinding is not really a big factor in this game, since once you hit a checkpoint, all the enemies you killed prior to it stay dead, so no repeat farming, it won't happen that much. This philosophy of once past, it's done rears its ugly head in worse places though, since, mind you, I don't really care too much about the enemies staying dead, but I do mind that I can get hard locked out of backtracking to places I already visited, especially in locations where there are very obviously multiple secrets, but a severe lack of resources to truly explore them all unless you have already mastered the game to a point where you could do a no-hit run. Since obviously if you die before reaching the next checkpoint, enemies come back to life along the entire path and you have to redo all the puzzles and annoying wave combats again. One specific segment that stands out to me with this is an elevator section you encounter fairly early on, where you have a save point at the top that you cannot get back to once you start the segment, but once you complete the segment, you cannot repeat it again. Within this segment, there are multiple puzzles where you must memorize symbols that appear for about half a second as an enemy dies to solve the puzzle, and you must use them in the order given, and it differs each run, so no memorizing them for each subsequent run. The real catch is, this segment has 2 of these memorization puzzles, with one of them being against a whopping 4 monsters, against what the game specifically describes as especially dangerous enemies with multiple life bars and varying armor bars. This combined with multiple side areas to explore, as well as multiple wave battles, meaning that it's quite an arduous journey just to finish it, much less complete the side areas with even more of these dangerous enemies and a few additional puzzles. And you either have to do all these in one go, or forfeit chunks of it due to the placement of the save points, and the zone being impossible to return to once completed. Now, as you may be able to tell by how invested I am in it, I wanted to like this game. And to an extent, I actually do, in spite of my frustrations, and I may go back to beat it out of sheer stubbornness, since I spent a decent number of hours in it exploring the world, and I can see some people finding a ton of fun to master it. But if you're going into it for any other reason than the challenge or a Souls-like experience, you'll at best be frustrated and at worst disappointed. This is because in spite of the beautiful graphics, awesome music, and pretty decent story that I'd put about on par with titles like Blasphemous, the game really does come first and foremost as being designed to punish the player at times, and doesn't even really open up any of its horizontal design in an even remotely timely manner, especially if you happen to go through in what is apparently the wrong order like I did, since there was a whole zone I didn't discover until much later, despite bashing my head against the bosses of other zones. My advice, if you do play this, make sure you find all the different paths you can go down before committing heavily to one, since it will be handy, quite literally in one case, to have alternate branches to go down if you get stuck at one or another. And despite my harsh judgments on the game leading up to this, I do still think it's a good enough game to pick up and play if you are mentally prepared for that challenge, especially if that is what you're looking for in a game as well. Just know what you're getting into before you dive into the game solely on the aesthetic or first impressions you see splattered around the internet. It's not a super fast-paced game. It is a lot of dodging, since unless this is your main genre, you will hit walls and they will hurt. After all that, if you think you are interested in the game, you can find an affiliate link to it in the Humble Bundle store down below, and it's a pretty good release discount as of the recording of this, being even a couple dollars cheaper than on Steam itself. And if you're interested in more laid-back top-down action games, check out the link on screen now for another fun title that's a little less serious.